Hi there, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for another episode of Triangle Talks. Today, we are so excited to be talking to you about a new initiative here in Wake County called A Better Wake that is focused on dismantling systemic racism here in our community and disrupting the disparities that have existed for so long. I am going to introduce you to Scott Buell, who is a lead volunteer here in the Triangle area, and he will be hosting our program. Scott, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Pax. Happy to be here today on a very interesting topic. We have with us today Dania Perry, who is Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusivity in the Raleigh Chamber, as well as Director of Equitable Economic Development for the Wake County Economic Development Program. Welcome. Thank you for joining us, Dania.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The auspices of today is disrupting disparities, and for that entity, we're looking at a Better Wake, an organization that is a coalition. Maybe it might be the best terms of other organizations that are focusing on this. That's the one thing that I am seeing in Wake County. There's a lot of different groups attacking these issues at different levels and things. And maybe you can explain to me a little bit more about A Better Wake and how it's organized and how its leadership is formed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure. Appreciate time with you, Scott. Appreciate Pax for the opportunity. Really excited to talk about A Better Wake, as it's literally been a collection of both public and private sector leaders to talk about how can we galvanize and coalesce around efforts to dismantle systemic racism. It's interesting, for us at least, at the Raleigh Chamber, we have been focusing in on, since 2018, work around equitable economic development and diversity, equity, and inclusivity, which we can talk about later. But this initiative, this awareness building campaign, came out of the renewed energy and spirit around after the murder of George Floyd and the attention around the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. We had a lot of community members and companies wanting to be a part of the anti-racist movement, wanting to talk about the infrastructures and the systems that create disparities between our Black and brown residents as compared to our white counterparts. So this convening started with, our city of Raleigh Mayor Baldwin, with our county commissioner at the time, County Commissioner Chair Greg Ford, our NAACP, the Chamber, the Triangle DEI Alliance, and along with other companies, just sitting around and trying to coalesce around how do we move forward together? How do we build and increase fluency about systemic racism to our community at large, and communicate strategies to dismantle? And so ultimately, this group pulled together a commitment statement. And that commitment statement is something that we're promoting on abetterwake.com, asking for community members, us as individuals, along with companies, to join us in this commitment, which ultimately shares and shows that there's this true intentionality and understanding, the history of systemic racism, but then also how do we all play a part in changing those systems, and notwithstanding, making sure that we all recognize that we all as individuals are part of a system, and so our decision making in those systems is critical in being able to dismantle any structures that will create disparities. So that has sort of been and we just launched. It's a brand new initiative. When I say brand new, it launched on MLK Day back in January. We were excited to share that, and we're still are pushing and promoting and wanting companies to solicit others to join the movement.
Okay, that gives me a better understanding of and the time frame, because I wasn't certain how long this has been formed. Obviously, this past year has been a challenge for any type of organization, and doubly so if they're trying to, just get started. I am aware of several other ones like One Wake and others that have just it's been a world of Zoom, which is both good and bad. So, how in your roles as the director of diversity and equity, that's a function of the Raleigh Chamber of Commerce, yes?
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
So what do you bring to the table, and how do you, what activities do you do to promote equity and inclusivity? What basically is your function of
Yeah.
day-to-day actions there?
Yeah. Well, if you don't mind, let me go back to talking about, I came on board in 2018 and specifically to serve the role as Director of Equitable Economic Development. And that construct ultimately came from our chamber CEO at this point right now, who had been in the role and lead economic developer for our region in our county. Was She recognized that we had growth in some communities, but not in others. And so as an economic developer, ultimately the goal is about increasing investments, increasing job creation. But the question was, do all of our residents have an opportunity to see the same type of prosperity? And so that really speaks to upward mobility, economic mobility, and how do we create infrastructures and a system to support all of that? So our amazing county commissioners pulled together, ultimately saying this is something that we need to be really needs to be a priority. So my position was created. I came into this role to focus on equity in relationship to economic development, which was the first of its kind, not only for the state but the country, and to have a conversation about the necessity of talking about all the levers that are critical to ensure people can go up that ladder. And there was a landmark study by Dr. Raj Chetty out of Harvard that spoke to how much your zip code was a predictor to how far you can go up that ladder. So in his assertion, depending on where you grew up, if you grew up in the bottom 20%, if you're in a certain zip code, the percentage likelihood of you moving from the bottom 20% to the top 20% is really, really tough. And so ultimately it says that when we look at the rungs of that ladder, if the rungs are too far apart, and there's components of economic mobility that we have to have, then we need to figure out how do we bring the rungs closer together to create opportunities to accelerate folks' economic mobility. And so in that work, we recognize that we needed to also support our existing industries in their diversity and inclusivity work. And that sort of led us to creating a more intentional positioning around supporting diversity and inclusion. And then we brought the equity from economic development work to create this DEI sort of space. And we look at D&I and DEI and I love the adage that one of the thought leaders in DEI stated, Verna Myers. She says diversity is being asked to the party, and inclusion is being asked to dance. And from my perspective, I added the E. So, using the same analogy, diversity is being asked to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. The E question, equity, asks, how does the person get to the dance to begin with? How do we get a person to the place that they can be, even though they're invited, and all the rules and all the barriers are down, that person can be invited, but are they truly included? Or is their voice magnified? So the diversity, equity, and inclusivity work, we build around how do we support existing industries through our professional development opportunities. We have an annual conference that we provide every year. We've created the Triangle DEI Alliance that seeks to do the work in supporting companies in their own DEI journey. We also facilitate incredibly courageous conversations. One of the last conversations we had was around how do we support social corporate activism and having conversations about systemic racism. We had an opportunity to bring Matthew McCarthy, the CEO of Ben & Jerry's, to have a conversation about how does their company see their role and how do they use their platform in social corporate activism, and whether it be from talking about anti-racist work all the way to climate change, but using that platform to bring awareness to it, and to also get people to a place where, we all can be contributors to the solution. So equity work is tough. It's the messy work to create spaces for diversity and inclusion. And so my work has been around accelerating our ecosystem in this space to create a new narrative about who we are as a community. And it really starts with the people.
And this has been so much in the news of late with activities in Georgia and the corporate activism of getting involved. And of course, the opposing sides of one group saying stay in your lane, and the other one saying no, this is our mandate to be involved in these activities. So typically, I have found North Carolina companies to be pretty conservative. So as the larger companies, that could be a tough sell for some of the more staid conservative ones. But at the same time, I see some hope that some of these people realize that to get the workforce that they need to be able to address these issues and not have them just be swept under the rug.
Yes.
So how do you either as an individual in your function or as a part of these groups, how do you speak out if you see areas that need a change? I mean, over the years, there have been so many things. It's such a tough nut to crack. I'm not certain where you go. Is it education? I mean, if you look at the history of Wake County's school system, they were segregated and then united under a single school system, and that creates problems of its own. There's still not an equity of resources that are available to each school system or each high school. Even though it's one school system, there's still inequities throughout there. How do you identify an area, or if you see an area, how do you raise that up and promote it to be addressed in some kind of policy or program mode?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, but I like to, acknowledge that, Scott, this conversation is where it starts. The fact that we're sitting, virtually, in front of each other and starting to have a conversation about what the challenges are, and having an honest conversation about what is our responsibility, whether we sit in a place of privilege, whether because of position or because of, our status within a community, whatever it is, our responsibility to understand that that is all interdependent. We stand on the intersection of, it is not only the right thing to do, but it's also, we get an immeasurable return on our investment for doing it. And this is a great business case. There's a business interest for diversity, equity, and inclusivity. And so what we like to lean on, and I'm by the beginning of my work was actually in research methodology. And so I always start with the data. And the data shows us the disparities that we're seeing in four major pillars, within education, within criminal justice, within health disparities, and also economic mobility. So if we rely on the data and we disaggregate it to understand, what populations are the most marginalized, then collectively we can all coalesce around, the areas that have certainly take more priority than others. Now, at the same time, I don't feel like we are so, I think we are talented enough and we have enough change agents and leaders. We can attack all of these systems. We can connect and make sure that, because we recognize education system and criminal justice system, there's a huge correlation between young people that drop out because maybe they did not have the adequate resources, and their likelihood, which is about, I think, 8 times more likely to get involved in the juvenile justice system and then roll over into the criminal justice system. So there's a school to prison pipeline that we know is there. So, by addressing and making sure that we coalesce leaders in each one of these spaces, I think it's less about which do we attack first. I think It's about acknowledging that, we see the challenges across the board and we all get on the same page about who's going to be. And I've been very jealous about people that can make references to that baseball, who's on first, who's on second, that I forget who actually who penned that joke. But the question is, who's on first and who's on second and who's on third, and then making sure that we're all collectively, speaking the same language and the fluency about this type of change work. Does that make sense, Scott?
It does, and it's and personally, I don't know if it's just my involvement has increased over the years, or I feel that in at least Wake County and maybe in the state, there are more of these conversations going on than have ever gone in the past. But at the same time, I still feel frustrated because some of the conversations are the same ones that they've had for decades, and that is and that's the frustrating portion of that. But I know
the cool part, right? I mean, that's sort of the cool part, because it's almost like I feel like we're trending up. If I look at the stock market, there's some divots there, but I would imagine my parents, when they're optimistically impatient about change, my mother, grew up through integration. And, when she thinks about that moment in time and then thinks about her son is having a conversation, to community members of the AARP community about systemic racism, to her, like, wow, that's growth, So I think it's perspective too, right? Don't you think?
Yes. Well, I had mentioned in our previous discussion that, my personal journey, this, my views on equity and inclusivity, of course, been tempered by my own experiences. And I grew up on a farm in rural Ohio. I mean, we had a big city near us and stuff, but I could scream and our nearest neighbor wouldn't hear us on that. And literally, there were, I think, 2 Black families in our school system. They weren't of the same age and things like that. So my interaction with people of color didn't occur until I really went off to college. I mean, that was the first time that I lived with people of color in a community and things. So, I'd like, as you said, I'd like to think that my views and attitudes are on an ever upward increasing slope there. But as a result of that, though, I see the importance of interactions and establishing the correct informations and attitudes at an earlier rather than later. So are there programs that you are involved with, or the Better Wake, for different age groups specifically to target and provide information and provide opportunities so that you can disrupt that school to juvenile delinquents pipeline and things? Is that part of this program, or?
Well, it's a part, but it isn't. So here it is where, I first, good example, I sit on the board for Communities and Schools of Wake County. The mission of Communities and Schools is about how do we, surround students with a community of support. The goal is to prevent dropouts and to increase graduation rates. So, we recognize that we have some students that have risk factors, whether it be, within the community, within the family, whether it be learning differences, needing a mentor, needing after-school programming support, tutoring, whatever those risk factors are. We fill in the gaps, right? We build some cohesion, we build some support infrastructures, and it looks different for each kid to ensure that they graduate. So the question becomes, in this conversation on dismantling systemic racism, is what created the gaps in this child's life, right? What are the infrastructure? Is it because mom has to work maybe 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet? So that means there's less time to be engaged in, education support, to be engaged with the school, to be able to provide the foundational support for that child. Is there transportation where that can alleviate some of the travel time, or even the support, again, for that family to be able to attain wealth, which helps to then build up their accessibility to be able to move up that ladder. So there's a lot of interplay, with all of this stuff that
Right.
we're doing. And what we are seeing now, nonprofits, they are serving, I mean, for the most part, they are serving as stopgaps to system failures. And so the question is, how do we create a system that benefits our entire community? Because research tells us it's a superior growth model. If we create a system and we tweak our system, if we identify a policy, we change a practice to create that system that helps support all residents, then everybody literally would blossom. I mean, so when we talk about dismantling systemic racism, it isn't about bringing people at the top lower to close the gap. No, it's about moving the folks who are most marginalized up. And so I think there's a conversation to be had with not just our private industries, but also our public NGOs and with our nonprofits that are within our community that have been doing this, working with marginalized populations for decades. Communities and schools have been in place for 30 years doing the work of filling in the gaps, but they may not have the capacity to change why there's poverty, or they don't have the capacity to change the transportation challenges. So that's all kind of incumbent as us as a community to champion opportunity for full participation.
Okay. In some of my background reading on this, I came across actually a Raleigh native who's recently published a book, Jim Crow in North Carolina, the legislative program from 1865 to 1920, and it highlighted the impact of Jim Crow issues upon North Carolina. And in that, he makes the argument that it was not so much the laws on the books, but he maintained that the segregation and oppressive Jim Crow systems, it was the long-standing community standards and customs and the allocation of community resources from the white power base that controlled all of that. And that was one of the, and it sounds similar issues here where we don't have the systems in place to get the funds to an area. Or I look at zoning laws that were restrictive in what and where people could build, redline issues, and that prevented people from taking that first rung up and gaining wealth in home ownership and things. So, do we still have those? How do we go about dismantling those structures and community standards that are still in existence out there?
That's that's a perfect. I love the examples that you shared about redlining and about housing segregation, and we tend to think that the Civil Rights Act in 1964 was what ended practices relationship to discrimination on race, along with a list of other tenets of discrimination. But specifically race, we recognize that even though in 1964 it was law, that the practice or the implementation of that, especially being reflective within the schools, didn't even start, or, you had to have people, like the Freedom Riders going into communities to help advocate for change and for integration up into 1969, 1970. But a lot of that was not about there's a lot of infrastructure conversation in relationship to a law like that being passed, but also more importantly, it was the interpersonal piece. And to me, when we talk about systemic racism, those are two big buckets that we have to address while we change and we look at, and we have companies and public entities dissecting their practices, their policies to make sure, that we are not creating unintended inequities or if we don't have bias in the decision-making process. But from an interpersonal standpoint, the question is, Scott, how do we work across difference? We both have two different lived experiences. We both have pretty strong backgrounds in the belief systems. And, that's how we're reared, right? We teach the way that we're taught. But the question is, when I look at you and you look at me, what are some barriers that, that we may have inherently about being able to see each other's perspective? And if I can challenge myself, if I can challenge those preconceived notions, then it helps me implement a practice and a policy better. It helps my decision making better. So good example. I had a story of a young man who he was an IT guru coming out of college, and he had been applying for jobs for 8 months, and he was top of his class, and he never got a hit. And his name was Raymall Sutton. And it's interesting because his friend told him, "Listen, I think you're not getting hits because there's a bias against your name." And people have a preconceived notion. They have a story about who Raymall Sutton is. So he asked them to shorten his name, and he shortened it to Ray Sutton. And he applied. He put that on his resume, sent it out again, got a hit within 2 weeks. And so the conversation becomes, as a decision maker, do I either, and I say all the time that well-intentioned people create inequities every single day. We always talk about culture fit, but rather my conversation when I'm building a team should be more about culture addition. So how am I adding to our existing culture versus bringing someone that fits the identity of me or the identity of my colleagues? So that's a question that I have to ask myself. I have to have the fortitude, the space, the reflection time, and the permission to say and challenge how we were reared, our preconceived notions about sex, gender identity, race, differing abilities, talking about folks with disabilities, returning citizens from the criminal justice system. Those are all these different elements that we have to let go of some of those internal prejudices and unintended biases that we have to move us forward to change a system. And so we must start with, and I call it simply the 3 R's. Reach in, reach out, and reach over. Reach in means doing a self-assessment. That means looking at yourself, looking at the mirror, spending some time on just connecting with yourself. Reach out means connecting with somebody that's different than you. And when we connect with somebody different, do it informally, do it over some drinks, do it over some dinner, even, spending time with people within their sacred space, going to worship with them, going to church with them. And then reaching over, the 3rd R is about recognizing that there will be barriers and there will be challenges, but you have to reach over and through them to connect with people that are different than you. And until we do that, in which we have seen that. And let me tell you, our Generation Zs and whoever the next generation after them, I think it's Generation Alpha, they are skilled at this. They are the most diverse generation that our country has ever seen. And this is normalized to them. Whereas, I'm a digital, I'm not a digital native, right? I grew up with
analog phones. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Right. But look, the new technology for us was a bag phone, Scott. Yeah. And I remember having a bag phone and having to charge it up, in your lighter in your car. So, these young people are digital natives. And so their connectivity is different than ours. My son plays video games with a friend in the UK. And, that's just unheard of for us. And so their experiences are so much different and they're so much accepting on so many other levels. So, these young people are blazing the trail for us to really build on that interpersonal part. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love your 3 R's approach to that. I think that's something I want to be able to remember and think about on there. And it is so true that you can't get out of your shell until you get out of your shell. I mean,
That's right.
You've got to engage activities and events that may not be in your comfort zone, but you need to stretch yourself a little bit. And in some ways, maybe the pandemic, we have, excuse me, to be thankful for that, because it's so easy to attend a Zoom meeting, regardless of where it is, versus I might not have gotten in the car for a 7 o'clock meeting and have to drive home at 9:30 or 10 o'clock or something like that. And on Zoom, it makes it easy, and you start to see that, hey, we can do these things. So yeah, maybe there's hope for us.
I would tell folks also, some of the cool things about learning and stretching your own cultural imagination is just listening to different radio stations. I didn't grow up listening to country stations, so country music. So I've gotten deep into Johnny Cash and listened to WQDR 94.7 country. locally. And again, a part of it is just about, using opportunities to be able to see another person's perspective. I call it grits, not girls raised in the South, but get right in their shoes. And part of get right in their shoes is an active participation to work across difference. And so you may hate some of the music of your kids, but the way I connect with my son is listening to what he listens to, and to understand that perspective, and understand and at the same time, I don't disqualify him because he doesn't like, I love, the Temptations and the Jackson 5. I'm not going to demonize him for not listening to that. But what I'm going to do is accept it and learn and try to figure out, okay, that's your groove. So I can respect that.
In our speaking of here, our focus was on dismantling race inequalities and things, but obviously, and you mentioned it, we have the gender equalities that occur, inequalities that occur, and for other communities, LGBTB and all of those. So I'm assuming that your offices and functions not solely focus just on race, but it is any kind of inequality that needs to be looked at. And again, it goes back to, while there are laws on the books on these various things that are hindering, most of that is the institutionalized cultures that are continuing to keep the inequalities in place. The whole gender and the healthcare, not healthcare, but personal care, caring for our elders, our children, that has created a lot of the gender inequalities that result. So I can see where, and I think the economic rungs that you talked about, the services of trying to prevent, you're looking at the root causes of what, why can't a mother be there for her child? Well, it's because she's working at a low end job, and she's working at two of them, and she has to be able to do that to support and put food on the table, and that robs the growth of the child, unless there's some kind of support system in place to care for that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, the pay for us, our diversity, equity, and inclusivity work, to your point, is not just about race. A Better Way, the initiative that comes out of our Triangle DEI Alliance, has a very specific awareness around systemic racism. The DEI work, it goes from, how do we create allyship for people with differing abilities, neurodiversity, gender, especially around the work around gender pay equity, our LGBTQIA plus community, looking at our returning citizens coming from the criminal justice system, and even the terminology, not talking about ex-offenders, where they're returning, they're returning citizens, and looking at how do we create allyship across the board and a space at the table for everyone. And for us, it's a conversation of, and I was just talking to our chamber CEO, Adrian Cole, about this, that we're not, we see intersectionalities with all of these areas. So it's not as if we address one area first and then the second. No, it's all interdependent. Inclusion is inclusion is inclusion. So what we want to do is to make sure that we have an ecosystem that's open, that's connected, that celebrates diversity, sees the value of diversity, that recognizes that when we don't have diversity, that we have to create and understand why. And then understand equity means not taking away from someone to give to others. Equity is about recognizing that if there is a barrier, we have to either remove the barrier or build a bridge over the barrier to create true diversity and inclusion. And that's what I'm most excited about our community right now. There's this amazing synergy and energy to be uncomfortable with, being comfortable with being uncomfortable, and to ask those tough questions and to challenge those old norms and belief structures. And so it's, to me, and again, goes back to your comment about, when I made, that we're trending up, it's a beautiful struggle for me being someone that sits at an intersection of being a Black male in this community, recognizing, the disparities that I see and have experienced and have lived experience with, but recognizing that we have allies across the board, and I truly believe until the unimpacted are outraged, we're not going to see change. And I'm seeing more people wanting to and willing to have these conversations than ever before. And talking about any of these topics, it's tough because we don't talk about them. I mean, and the reality is we don't talk about them sometimes because one, we feel uncomfortable, and two, we don't want to make a mistake. We don't want to offend anybody. But like my old football coach would say, listen, if you're going to get tackled running the football, just fall forward. Don't don't go backwards. Just fall forward because you're at least 1 inch closer to the end zone, and that's what we need to do. Everybody, just listen. Let's just we're gonna mess up. There's gonna be mistakes. Let's just fall forward.
Wake County and the city of Raleigh are about to impart on some huge development projects. How do we design those? I worked in the pharmaceutical industry, and the focus was always on designing quality into the process. You don't add something, you don't build something and then slap on a program or something afterwards. How do we get engaged and get a seat at the table to build in the necessary equality and exclusivity functions and items in these big, in some cases, multi-billion-dollar developments?
Mm-hmm. Across the board, when we talk about projects, especially those that may have an amazing, ripple effect to a community, and recognizing that with, we want to see growth. We don't want to have a community that is going to be deprived of resources for its growth. But recognizing that with the first steps that has to happen to make sure that there isn't that exclusivity in the process is to listen at the front end. And once you make sure that you bring in the community that's being impacted, all the partners, our economic development team, we're always about bringing all the partners together to have conversations about any project on any level. And a big part of that is also making sure that the community members that are being most impacted by that to be at the table to talk about the implications and to understand, like, listen, there's fear about gentrification and displacement. So are we talking about affordable housing? Are we talking about transportation? Are we talking about how do we help really incentivize and invigorate the small business and entrepreneurial ecosystem within that same community? How can this all be a part of the larger development versus, as you say, tacked on at the end of the project? And so I'm extremely, our city of Raleigh and also our county has done amazing jobs and doing stuff that wasn't fluent, which was about connecting with the community and having conversation and being intentional. The thing that we have to also be very aware of is that historically, those folks that have been most left out of the conversations are going to be the most resistant because historically they've been left out of the conversation. So we have to understand that we're working at a place where, there's distrust in the system. And that's our role and responsibility to build that trust, build those relationships before you need them, and making sure that it's not a case of just wanting your voice and we're going to do whatever we want anyway, but to be completely honest and transparent about the process, to make sure that we have all the information at the table, and to make sure that we have great stewards of the community who are really that really have voice at the table. Because at the end of the day, again, I think our ecosystem is moving to a place of true equity and true inclusivity. That's the only way that everybody gets to be prosperous. Is if we have everybody's voice at the table and we make sure that we have a level of connectivity.
So if I'm, Joe Citizen out here or working at a company, how do I get involved? How do I move out of my little shell and become engaged in these functions? What's the best process or mechanism for that?
Well, you know,
Run for public office, but
I would say the tried and true, you know, are obviously get involved in your, whether it be town council meetings, city council meetings, county commissioner meetings. I mean, that's obviously the low hanging fruit. If we really want to talk about, moving forward and connecting with non-traditional ways of connecting, think about nonprofits that are out there championing the work, you know, from Passage Home, with Seth Friedman, Director Seth Friedman, or Jobs for Life with Director Ryan Ray, or working with, you know, right now, Katie Gales is doing an amazing work over at Wake Tech around this movement around our voices, and they are bringing together diverse groups of individuals to talk about and to share their story, to talk about race, to talk about marginalized communities. Communities and schools is another opportunity to be involved and to volunteer, to be a part of the process. So there are a lot of different opportunities, and I can't just say, you know, one cookbook method to engage the way that you want. But I will say on a micro level, outside of an organization, just think about, do sort of a self-analysis of your circle. And if you look at your circle, and if everybody thinks like you, if everyone looks like you, then think about opportunities to branch out. And think about spaces that you can branch out and connect with. And you're not looking for someone to solve your problem of diversity. You know, you're looking for someone to help expand your thought. And so ultimately what you want to do is make sure that you're coming in with a sincere and authentic, opportunity versus something in which you're saying, I don't understand, make me, teach me something I don't know. One thing that we've also been promoting with A Better Wake, if you go to the website, there's a tab under resources. And specifically, if you want resources around anything around systemic racism, we have podcasts, videos, books to do some self-exploration, which we always ask people to do. And with the internet now, again, there's no excuse to not just, getting on and tagging on and then truly being able to have access to any information. I will also acknowledge the fact that one of the larger challenges that we're having with most of our rural communities is actually broadband access. And so that's another big part about economic mobility and the right to. And you even kind of felt my bias in just making that recommendation, as if everybody has access to broadband to get the information. And I'm checking myself daily on that assertion, how easy it is to get the information. And I've just dismissed anybody that can't get the information. Right. So right. Again, it's a daily challenge to continually think about, when I create information as an initiative, how can I make sure everybody has access? How can I make sure everybody has an opportunity to get the same information? And it's a day-to-day struggle, but I truly love it, and I think we're going in the right direction, Scott.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and Raleigh, Wake County is growing by what, 30 or 40 people a day?
66 people a day.
66, wow. And so we are going to continue to have development. We need to be able to use the resources that we have, and to tackle, as you said, reach over some of these barriers that we know are there, and we just need to have the will to get beyond that. I think, do you have any final thoughts or words here? We can probably wrap this up, and maybe offline we'll schedule a time for more conversations, because there are so many of them that I have, and questions that I have of how best to move forward on this.
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
Go.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't have all the answers, but and I have a lot of good friends and colleagues that do, and I'd just like to thank you, Scott, for engaging this conversation and your willingness to have this conversation. Thanks, Pax, for the opportunity to setting this up. I think this is a wonderful platform for our interpersonal growth, to have this conversation and to visibly see a conversation of folks trying to work through it. I always ask people to be vulnerable and not knowing, because by being vulnerable and not knowing and sharing that you don't know and that you want to learn, you give other people permission to do the same. And that helps to eliminate and to really strip away any hesitation for us to evolve and to get to a better place where we can all be successful and connected. And so I'm just, again, excited, and I appreciate you all for having this conversation.
And I'll put in my little commercial for AARP right now. If you are listening to this and if this has stirred a thought about becoming involved in either equity, in inclusion, or any of the other items that AARP is a champion for, they have a very active program in the advocacy for laws, and it's across the board. Anything affecting the people in the 50+ age group, livable communities, home health care advocacy, and financial freedoms that will help people get to that next rung. Any of these things, if you have a desire to be involved in this, reach out to Pax. I think she had her email address on there earlier, and let us know what your interests are, and we'll find a place to put your passions to work. So again, Daniel Perry, thank you very much for being with us, and you've given us a lot to think about. So thank you, and hope you have a good day.
My pleasure. You all take care.
All right, bye.